Hey guys, Palsteron here, and today is about Hexblast of Contradiction. So since this league has been a little bit of a bummer for me, one thing I wanted to do again is do a little bit of Leaguestart testing, actually kind of use the time that we have instead of just grinding the same thing over and over, having to reroll tier 70s 100 times. I just wanted to put in the work and try something newish, at least for a Leaguestart scenario, which is the new Hexblast of Contradiction. Now, there is a version of this skill that already exists that this is also inspired by. At least it's the first time I actually thought about this skill, which was when Captain Lance made his guide, which is basically just Energy Blade Hyper Endgame. And we're going to talk about that one as well, but there are other ways to get around the downside. In the mechanics section, I'm gonna basically talk about that. But the gist of Hexblast of Contradiction is it does more damage, and you resist enemy hits by your highest res instead of your lowest, which sounds like a crazy downside, but we're going to talk all about it. What Captain Lance did basically is it says Chaos Res is resisted by highest, so he just went full Energy Blade, which is all lightning damage. So he basically just took the skill as a glorified damage effectiveness stat stick. What we're doing here, however, is a little bit more interesting. Now, a lot of you guys have already played Hexblast before, and you know how OP this skill is. For me personally, it's one of the 3 top League starters right now in the game, and it is one of the candidates to get nerfed. If you've never played the skill, you can look at my 3.22 guide. Also, Ventura has a really good Trickster guide out for 3.23, and I think also 3.24, I can't remember. But this has been not really a secret of a skill in the last few leagues, and it is one of the most underrated skills, which is quite funny because people know it's good, but people don't know how quite good it is. People have been pushing tier 17s as one of the first people with Hexblast builds, normal Hexblast that is. So with the premise of understanding how strong Hexblast is, we can also look at Hexblast of Contradiction a lot easier. So let's get first into it. What are the differences between the two? Now, if you're completely new to Hexblast, Hexblast is basically a high damage effectiveness, high flat damage skill with a very low crit chance that basically gets more damage if the enemy was hexed, which is basically every curse but marks. Marks do not count. If the enemy was hexed, you get 100% more damage, and then it removes the curse. So basically what you have to have is kind of a curse on hit system where you can reapply it over and over. The reason people play this skill on mines is very simple, just because of the cast time. You want to overwrite that cast time, and on mines that is very easy. Now, mines trigger after each other, which is why you never see it on traps, because traps explode all at once, which means you cannot reapply the hex. Basically, of those hits, as far as I know at least, only one of the traps that goes off simultaneously would get this bonus, which is why on mines where you have a detonation chain where it goes curse, remove, curse, remove, curse, remove, it's way, way, way better. And it has a clause right here, which basically makes it unplayable with cast on crit. So everything that can reset the cast time to 0.25, like mines, is OP with the skill. Now, there's more to the skill, though, because all damage can ignite, freeze, and shock. And that is very noticeable. Even though it's chaos damage, it can apply all of those. Especially freeze is really big. Do note, though, that chill is absent from here. Another very unique modifier on the normal Hexblast is chaos damage with hits is resistance by the lowest resistance instead. So, for example, if the enemy's resistance, the lowest one, is after flammability and fire exposure, you get it to like -20 fire res, it will take that resistance and not anything else, not anything relating to chaos. Now, so you know the most important things about Hexblast right now. Like I said, you can look up a build guide if you want to, but Hexblast of Contradiction has 3 noticeable differences. Let's start at the first one. Hexblast of Contradiction has not only 100% more damage with hits if the enemy's hexed, it has 150%, which comes out to 25% more damage. It also has higher base crit. It goes from 4 to 6, which is kind of like a 50% more critical strike increase. Granted, you don't have any other base crit increases. Otherwise, it has the same base damage, same damage effectiveness, just 25% more damage and plus 2% base crit. You have to, however, go Inquisitor. We're going to go over why that is in a second, but basically, the line here that's different is chaos damage with hits is resistance by the highest resistance instead. So while Hexblast is very easy to negate, you just basically stack, I don't know, LE weak plus flammability plus fire exposure, and you're going to get the enemy very low. On this skill, it is a downside, and in order to get enemies to below 0 res, you would have to reduce not just every LE res, you would also have to reduce chaos res. So there is a lot of good things right here. 25% more damage, huge. Plus 2 base crit, also huge, because it doesn't make you have to go Sandstorm Visage, But how do we counteract this downside? The reason we go Inquisitor is Inevitable Judgment. Now, how does this work with Hexblast of Contradiction? What I'm about to say is the information that I've gotten from people who played the build, now me included, and I felt the same way, as well as people on PoE Wiki, as well as some other people who tried the build. Mark has responded to this question by somebody, but was very cryptic and very ominous about how this works. However, this is the running theory. And from everything I've tested, from everything I felt like, resistance modifiers and whatnot on maps, this is how it should work. And once again, if you have anything to the contrary, let me know. If you have like a better Mark post, I only saw that one post where he replied with like 2 sentences. Maybe there's something else out there. So the skill says chaos damage is resistant by highest res. Now, Inevitable Judgment says critical strikes ignore enemy monster LE res. So that means that if you roll a crit and your highest resistant is any elemental resistance, that resistance will get ignored for the purposes of Hexblast of Contradiction. This is important to know because these are the resistances of most bosses, especially Guardian and Pinnacle bosses, all of the big bosses. And as far as I know, at least, there aren't really any mobs that have more Chaos Res than LE Res. And even if they did, a simple Despair Curse in your setup would lower the Chaos Res to be below LE Res. The only exception is, for example, stuff that only increases Chaos Res on like a League Mechanic mod, which would be counteracted immediately if it also had an LE Res mod, right? And the Wither mod on the mod that gives like Chaos Res and Wither on rares. But just to clarify this again and show you in POB, for example, a Pinnacle boss all the way down here, 50% LE Res, 30% Chaos Res. What would happen if you have a crit right here is the game would take one of the elemental resistances or all of the elemental resistances as your highest res, and since that res is elemental, the Inquisitor node would ignore that resistance. What people thought a while ago, actually I remember this discussion when this gem came out, is okay, it's going to ignore the LE res, so it's going to jump to Chaos Res, making the skill still not very good. But I'm pretty sure what's actually happening is it takes the LE res, ignores it, and then forgets that Chaos Res even exists. Once again, this is also reinforced by people who played the skill and tried it with and without Despair, and it's also, I think it's all even said like that. On the PoE Wiki page, Inquisitor will remove resistance from being calculated. Yeah. So basically, that is how it should work, and that's why the skill is actually very attractive. And that is why you actually do not need to go Energy Blade if you don't want to. You don't need to stack other forms of damage that isn't Chaos. You can also just do it like I just said. Does that mean Energy Blade is not the way? Of course not. Energy Blade is very strong in endgame. It's just something that is very important to know for Leaguestart, because I do not want to rely on Energy Blade on Leaguestart personally, and I don't want to give a new player anything like that. Now, okay, so what is now different in general from a normal Hexblast build? Okay, so you start as an Inquisitor. Boohoo, big deal. It is actually a pretty big deal because it has implications, both negative and positive, on how the build plays out. Now, first, let's look at what Hexblast builds normally play, because aside from having to go Inquisitor, the skills are very similar, right? So what they usually go for, this is day 3, because we're talking about Leaguestart. Sabo and Trickster, I think, are pretty much heads up. If I had to say, I prefer Sabo a little bit more early, whereas I think Trickster gets a lot better later. I played a Sabo in 3.22. Ventura has a really good Trickster guide, which I love. Occultist, I'm not really sure. It has been getting a lot more over time. I think it's because of bossing, but I'm not 100% sure. But needless to say, a lot of builds go for Shadow, and Shadow side is very friendly towards mine builds, which means that you can start with mines very early if you so choose to. Obviously, Hexblast needs some setup, but all you really need is a Dread Arc, right? Your first curse, and you're usually going to do fine. Inquisitor, however, is quite a bit of pathing. Now, I'll talk about this a little bit more because it's actually not as bad as you think, because Mind over Matter EB is something that is very strong. Anyways, these pathing nodes are very good. Getting Melding is something you would probably do anyways. However, especially early on, you're not going to be able to play mines. Let's talk about more implications, though, versus Hexblast. We're basically going to compare this with Hexblast right now. On Hexblast of Contradiction, you can actually use defensive curses. Now, I'm not using both Enfeeble and Temp Chains on this one, but I am using Enfeeble. And if you look at my effective hit pool, it is quite a big deal. Enfeeble is very, very strong, especially if you can have it actually leveled and you don't just have it as a curse on hit. as my curse on hit here, I actually do have Despair. For the rare occasions where enemies' Chaos Res is actually higher, I bring it down, and then most likely the Ellie Res is higher, and once again, then Inevitable Judgment puts the res to 0. However, to know if this is actually worth it, I'll still have to do some more testing. It could also just be Temp Chains. Temp Chains and Feeble would actually be huge, whereas a normal Hexblast build would go Flammability, Ellie Weak, or Frostbite, Ellie Weak, whatever you're setting up for. So that is already a huge upside. You can also start with any curse. I will show you real quickly. I have different snapshots actually of the gear we've taken. By the way, I am testing on standard. Don't really think anything about it. The reason I went on standard is this is actually the first league where I cannot skip the league mechanic, which means the maps would just be needlessly harder. And if I crafted with Necropolis, it would be kinda like cheating. But just to show you real quickly, this is the gloves that I sort of bought as like a proxy at level 70. And these are any gloves with any curse other than Elemental Weakness. If you took Elemental Weakness, that is very bad because now you're decreasing all your Ellie res and now your Chaos res is probably the highest. Anything else, it doesn't matter. As long as it doesn't hinder your build, it is actually a 1 in 22. If you just take any gloves and corrupt them with a Vol Orb, it's, as far as I know, a 1 in 22 to get any okay curse. So whereas you might actually think that Hexblast is easier to set up, in fact, this one is easier to set up because you don't have to stack Ellie Weak plus Flammability to do full damage. It doesn't matter, it just has to have a curse. However, it also has negative implications. You have to level with a non-mind skill, and for that, you go for the meta Rolling Magma into Armageddon brand Cremation, and you start this journey after the campaign. The reason I'm also saying after the campaign is because Hexblast of Contradiction is a Transfigure gem, and farming for Transfigure gems is the least annoying in Merklab because you can actually target farm them way easier. This is especially important on SSF. Obviously, if it's off meta, right? But I usually cannot pretend like the builds I'm going to put out will be off meta. So in case I play it, obviously that is going to be a big role. How can you actually farm it yourself? But yeah, the leveling is pretty damn standard. The only problem is you want to do as little respecs as you can because you don't want to have people, I don't know, use 50 regret orbs. So there is a few concessions I have to make, mainly like this whole part here, which you will have to replace with just going straight here later. But it is important to get a little bit of extra fire damage out here. But basically the way you're going to level, we're going to talk about that probably a little bit later in the video, is you have to go from the left side all the way to the right side. And the point where you can actually start Hexblast of Contradiction will be around about level 65 to level 70, which is definitely a downside. However, on Leaguestart, if you don't have a Dread Arc, you could say very similar things about Hexblast. If you actually have to level with Pyroclast Mine, it is not a better experience than Rolling Magma or Armageddon brand Cremation, which is actually kind of OP. But for a lot of people, this is a downside. I also like to play my skill as fast as possible. It's also harder to keep spell suppression. Now, in the endgame version, we do actually path all the way to Inveterate right here. We take this whole cluster, and we also take Instinct. And then I think you need 2 or 3 gear pieces with a tier 2 roll of spell suppression. However, on a Trickster, you wouldn't really need that at all, and you're already prime positioned to grab all the clusters. And like I said, you have to actually farm for a Transfigure gem, whereas Hexblast is, yeah, you don't need to. Maybe some support skill, but the main skill gem is a Transfigure gem, which comes with its downsides, right? You have to kind of transition into it, you have to farm it, depends. Now, comparing Inquisitor to stuff like Trickster or Sabo right now, how does that actually line up? You don't have any mana issues. You don't need to use a mana flask, and that is mostly because of Mind Over Matter and Eldritch Battery. So with Inquisitor, you will go Pious Path, which means your regen is going to be Energy Shield and Life Regen at the same time. So you're going to stack a Life Regen and get basically double value out of it. And with Mind Over Matter, you're kind of splitting the damage between Life and ES. And with Eldritch Battery, that also means now you are spending your mana with your Energy Shield that recovers really quickly. So your mana cost is basically non-existent, which not only means that you can reserve all the way to 0%, it also means you don't have to get any minus mana on your rings, basically freeing up your jewelry. And then also, in the worst case scenario, even early, you might have to use a mana flask. On this build, it doesn't exist, and you obviously cannot go EB on Trickster because Energy Shield is actually a big part of your survivability, and Mind Over Matter is very much out of the way. Then you have Insane Recovery. I mean, I don't think I need to say much about Pious Path here, but you can stack a lot extra regen. One thing I also want to note is since you don't need Sandstorm Visage theoretically anymore, you can even do stuff like Vol's Vision, which gives you an extra 400 life, and otherwise you just stack stuff like Vitality, and you get some random percent regen from stuff like Quick Recovery and Sanctity. And another neat little thing is actually, let me see where I have that one. It is right here. There's also a 2.5% life regen on one of the Mind Masteries. Nice little addition. And once again, it doesn't need Sandstorm Visage, which could open it up for the helm I just talked about. It could also open it up for a defensive helm. For example, a double Fizz Taken Ass helmet, or maybe a double Reservation helmet. You fix your res easier, you get an extra life roll, extra ES roll, it's just great. And since we are positioned like this on the passive tree, we could theoretically also go armor. In my current version, I am still Grace, but that might actually change in the endgame version. I might just go for Jade Flask and have like 50-ish of HNs and then just go for D-Term. This is also possible because we're actually here at Faith and Steel, and if you get to around about 40k armor, this is especially something if you go Mage Blood version, obviously, later. But you can actually go for stuff here like Fizz damage taken as Chaos conversion. You can't really go for Xibaqua because on Inquisitor it's just kind of awkward. But yeah, you will have a lot of extra chance to grab some armor, and then can be really, really strong, especially in tier 17s. This is also a nice addition because Inquisitor can actually grab spell suppression while having that kind of regen, while actually getting okay evade chance and grab armor at the same time. So there's a lot more potential to sacrifice some of your damage for more defenses, which can be trickier on Trickster or Sabo unless you want to sacrifice Grace for D-Term, and then you don't really have much percentage armor at all. Going armor would also open up stuff like Molten Shell. But with that said, there's some more downsides right here, which would be, for example, you have to compensate for Mind Throwing speed. So if you look at Sabo, you will see that these small nodes right here, these right here have 5% Mind Throwing speed, 5% Mind Throwing speed. And if you go Trickster, you will see you have +2 Frenzy Charges, which means 20% throwing speed. And then if you have action speed, if you don't have your boots yet, then also 1 step ahead gives you extra. You have to make up for that. Now, most of these builds are actually not using all of the tools available anyways, because it's not worth for them at a certain point to stack even more Mind Throwing speed. However, especially early game, there is a little bit more of a period where you want to go with Swift Assembly instead of Minefield, because otherwise it feels awkward on Inquisitor. However, at this point, it is absolutely smooth sailing. Once you have your Frenzy Charges, once you have maybe a Jewel with 7% Mind Throwing speed, you grab all the other Mind Throwing speed, which is mostly here. I have 15% on my wand. I have I think this is a Shrieking Essence, 16% right here. And I have, no, actually, I don't have a crafted roll right here because I didn't have the thing. But in general, this is where it starts to feel a lot smoother. Also, quality on Minefield helps as well. As well as that, you can also anoint Destructive Apparatus, or even path like this, which I think is a little bit awkward, but it's also an option. And the last downside is obviously you lose some defensive parts from what the Shadow Nodes had as well. So for example, on a Trickster, you would lose Spellbreaker, which is incredible, especially against bosses. And on Saboteur, you would lose Born in the Shadows, which is straight up 15% less damage taken, which you mostly make up by going sort of hybrid Life ES with Mom EB, but it's still something that has to be noted. When it comes to gearing, I had like 3 stages that we tried out. The first one was a very early, basically, I kept most of my campaign gear and added a little bit extra for resistances. I added a 5-link, trashy 5-link or whatever. I threw some essences on some stuff. But now we are at stage 3, which is kind of like red maps plus, which is where I invested. So what we calculated is around about 5 to 6 divines right now in terms of what Leaguestart divines would be. So right now, obviously this gear you could probably get for, I don't know, 50C, 60C, but I'm saying Leaguestart divines, right? So what we have here is, first up, wand. All you really want on wand early is increased damage. Now, if you are playing a miner, especially on my version right now, where I don't even have a cluster jewel yet, the first important thing is get a lot of increased damage. You're going to be quite increased damage starved. So obviously the optimal would be to also have percentage damage in the implicit, but that's just in general what it is. Flat damage to stuff like cold or fire is still valuable because of Inevitable Judgment. Now, obviously, it's the same as with shield. In a perfect world, you would want +1 to chaos, but that is something that was not in the budget. And I feel like people usually over-invest early into +2 levels when they haven't even fully realized their percentage damage stuff. So I personally don't think these are worth early until you go into 10, 20 divine stuff. Other than that, all we really did is just look that we have our spell suppression cap, look that we have enough crit chance. Right now we're around about 95%, and that is about it. This helmet is obviously really bad. This is, I think, a self-found helmet. Also, I just threw random implicits on. This one is pretty much shit, right? Obviously, I want Fist taken as, I want Reservation, but it is what it is. This amulet is probably my best piece, although it's not as good as you think because I cannot craft on Mind Throwing Speed, which would have been a nice one. But yeah, this one's pretty nice. And at this point, I did invest into a Silver Oil to anoint Destructive Apparatus, which is very, very strong in general. What I did before Destructive Apparatus is actually I went Wandslinger, which is a very cheap, very, very cheap anoint for just 30% increased damage. It just costs you an Amber Oil, which, yeah, it's just one of the cheapest ones. The reason I say that is because when you have a really shitty Ami, what you really want is throw a shitty anoint on. You don't want to throw a good anoint on a shitty Ami. As I said early on, the curse on hit that I had was actually these gloves right here. But then later, you definitely want to get out of this garbage and you want to get a curse on hit. Now, it doesn't really matter which curse on hit, but obviously Despair is a very nice one. The way you craft these is actually Reforge Caster, and you can't really be picky. As you can see right here, I basically have Dexterity roll and 15 res, and then you just craft on life, and you just take whatever you can get. If you want a good Despair ring, it's going to cost you a lot more. My second ring is basically just a little bit of resistances, crafted tier 2 damage, and like tier 2 life, right? Basically just throwing up resistances. And right now what I'm doing is I'm actually not using Profane Proxy. I'm using Blasphemy plus Enfeeble for my second curse. That is obviously very nice because Enfeeble leveled is a lot stronger than a level 1 from a curse on. One really nice tech item as well is Dodra's Tenure. This will straight up give you 100% increased spell damage. As we said, you're very starved on increased damage. The reduced cast speed does absolutely nothing, and it is a prime corruption target for any curse you can get early. If you can get your hands on a Dodra's Tenure, for example, with Despair on hit, that would be premium, or stuff like Temp Chains on it. After that, what you want is a heavy belt if you can, because with Inquisitor, we definitely want to go stack some strength. Strength is your lower of the two attributes, basically always until you go into like the 300s. Right now we only have 200, but yeah, every bit of strength you can get is going to be increased crit. And what we do is we use Essence of Zeal to get the trap and mind throwing speed, and then you just basically keep whatever you can. In this case, I got two tier 3 resistance rolls. Actually, one of them is tier 1 and one of them is tier 2, and I just crafted on mana. That's basically the end of it. If you don't have a life roll, you might have to be a little bit more picky with what you pick in the suffixes. As for boots, I really tried fake buying them on standard. Like, I tried to get shitty boots on standard, but it's almost impossible, so I had to craft them myself. The boots that were on the market were all just insane. So I bought 25% fractured movement speed, and this is close to what I would probably buy on day 1 usually for my boots. I just ran with them. As you can see, it is the wrong base, but that is actually pretty nice because this way you can get an easy 4 reds, which you need for your gems a little bit later. If you can throw on action speed or movement speed, both are very strong. In the implicit, the second one I just hit whatever. Here, you just want life and resistances. That's basically all you can hope for. If you have the right base, you want, obviously, Spell Suppress. For the gem setup, Hexblast of Contradiction is pretty much your main skill. I only went for level 20, mainly because... So Hexblast, I would go for level 21 at this point, because you don't need the quality. So you can just go for a 21-0. You level offhand, and you're almost always going to hit it within like 7 takes. Otherwise, you just level again. But with Hexblast of Contradiction, this could be expensive because it's a Transfigure gem, so I stayed at 20. The quality, once again, completely irrelevant, does absolutely nothing. It's just that on standard, you literally cannot get a... I couldn't get one without quality. But increased crit... so basically what I did with the support gems is I threw a few GCPs on to kind of like fake this thing where you buy like a, I don't know, 12 to 15 quality support gem, and instead of flipping it later, you fill it up with GCPs, and that's basically what I simulated here. Ink crit chance makes Inevitable Judgment a lot more consistent. It's a good damage multiplier, so I go with that. Charged Minds completely fixes your mind throwing speed. It's extremely important to get your frenzy charges as soon as possible. Also, you get a ton of power charges for your crit. High Impact Mine, this one is a little bit interesting. I just prefer High Impact Mine and Blast Chain Mine. I could talk about this for probably 15 minutes, but whatever you want. In general, it is a lot nicer, especially now that your chains will be automated, which we're going to go over in a second. Minefield support, as I said, Swift assembly support is incredibly strong until you can get the mind throwing speed to make this one feel good. When you first get into maps, your minefield support is probably like level 14 or something, and every level counts. It has less and less mind throwing speed, right? So it gets better and better over time, and then the quality also gives another 5%, and then you also need to have the upgraded craft that goes up to 15 instead of up to 12, right? You have to craft your belt. If you can, you even want to get it on your amulet and stuff like that. So at some point, it's going to start feeling good. It's just kind of something you have to feel out. It's a little bit weird because one is green, one is blue, so you have to kind of like wing it. But in general, minefield for me felt good from like level 80-ish onwards. And then at the end, crit damage support. Now, once we have actual jewels like this, right now the only jewel I have in is actually a 2-stat jewel. Only 2 of these stats actually matter, mind throwing speed and crit multi for spell damage. Once you get more crit multi from jewels, you have like a double cluster jewel setup, you can definitely reconsider the crit damage and you can go for mine and trap damage. But right now, I don't want to use that support because it gives me 10% less mind throwing speed and it would kind of feel off. Now then, what I've implemented is a call to arms setup with Enduring Cry. Important to know here is that yes, it can give you endurance charges. It's going to be a little bit inconsistent, but really nice is the regen. You get a ton of extra regen. If you can put another increased duration in, that is huge, especially for an Inquisitor. It can be quite of a game changer. Call to arms. I also have Arrogance with Vitality, which, yeah, as you can see, right, actually, you cannot see right here. That is kind of what I have reserved on life. Then I have a Zealotry set up with increased duration and Divine Blessing Inspiration. Also an upside of being EB, being able to press Zealotry for another 20% more damage. On my wand, I have Shield Charge, Faster Attacks, and Momentum. Pretty self-explanatory. If you don't have the colors for this, you can also cut the momentum, although on this build, it's quite important that you get your 3-link for this. Blasphemy and Enfeeble is basically until I get Profane Proxy. I'm still not 100% sure if that's better, but it will make your gem starvation pretty rough. For example, right now, I don't even have my Bear Trap in. I would kind of have to swap that in and out for momentum whenever I'm bossing. Not that I'm really using it anyways while normal mapping, but it's still a little annoying right now. And then, yeah, Enfeeble with Blasphemy and then Grace. As you can see, I'm not using Skitterbots. Skitterbots are good, but what you have to remember is we're already shocking with Hexblast for probably more than 10% most of the time. So that part is completely useless of Skitterbots. The chill is nice because you actually can't chill with Hexblast. But other than that, you're just getting 10% more damage for 35% reservation. So unless you have Profane Proxy, Skitterbots are just completely worthless. As for passive tree, this one's pretty self-explanatory. Now, obviously, these 2-point jewels would be filled out as soon as you have some money and you can actually fill them out. The cluster jewel would be a no-brainer, large, medium, and you would probably cut some of this stuff right here. This is what I'm planning on in endgame. Once you can figure out your dexterity, you can figure out your spell suppress. This is kind of not needed. You just have to anoint charisma and go with the flow. The thing about this build is actually that all your attributes just figure themselves out. You don't really have to spec anything. We have a very balanced approach here of strength, int, dexterity. You don't really need anything on your gear. Maybe a tiny bit of dexterity. But in general, it's just completely figured out. You get so much strength as well. You're kind of like the way you path, it's just all figured out. One important thing to note, I guess, about mines in general, if you don't know, mines have a flat reservation whenever you put them down. So for example, if I do this right here, you will see that my mana goes down quite significantly. And then if I wait and they explode, you will see it popping back up to like round about the 40% mark right here whenever they run up. So that is because they have reservation while they're down. And you want to be able to put down 23, which is your maximum with Minefield plus the passive tree. So as you can see right here, you can see it 20 and then 23. This is where it stops. And that's where your reservation has to hold out. If it's like 20 or 19 or 18, you don't have your full damage potential at bosses, which isn't the end of the world, but it is a thing to consider. Important to know is that is a flat reservation. It's not percentage reservation. It's like a flat, I don't know, 20 mana reservation. So increasing your mana pool actually will also increase the amount of mines you can throw down. So taking stuff like Mind Drinker is actually very nice. You want one mana cluster anyways, because then you also get the mana reservation. But just so you know, if you're wondering why I have like these mana rolls on some of my stuff, which I actually removed, I don't really need it. But if you need reservation, you can definitely do stuff like this. Other than that, you obviously have Mind Over Matter, Eldritch Battery, an old classic for Inquisitors. Make sure you definitely take Sanctity here. It's not just regen, it's also armor and energy shield. Armor doesn't matter all that much, but it's just really, really strong. And the next thing I would take is probably Quick Recovery or these jewels right here. Definitely take a lot of the hybrid nodes. Melding is insane. So is Written in Blood. All of these nodes are premium. Make sure that your spell suppression capped. Another thing you can do is, if you have problems with spell suppression, if you have all the right bases with evasion on, you can also take the mastery. That gives you 15% chance to spell suppress. I don't really have that right now because my boots are fucked up, but yeah, it is what it is. If you're starved on increased damage, definitely something you want to do is take this mastery right here. Important to know as well, because you might be wondering, where's my AoE coming from? Because the AoE kind of looked decent in the intro. It's actually from stuff like here. So Hexblast is actually considered a Hex skill. So increased area of effect of Hex skills increases the AoE of Hexblast, which is also why you will see some people anoint skittering runes because of the 50% AoE, which is quite huge. What I opt to do instead, since I want to have the extra mind throwing speed right here, is you can also go for increased area of effect of aura skills. This one only works. It's also here, right? So in total, it's 42%. This only works if you have high impact mind, because this basically makes your Hexblast into an aura, right? So what that means is this will actually increase the AoE of your skill. As for leveling, you will see me not take some nodes that obviously racers would take, but that is simply because my game doesn't end after level 70, right? I would have to respec all of those points, and I like to keep them to a minimum. The respecs on this build are like, I think 25 to 30-ish respecs that you'd need. 20 you obviously get from the campaign, and the last ones you can kind of do over time. It's not a big deal. But basically, the way I want to go for this is we're going first up for Rolling Magma, and then later we're going for Cremation and Armageddon Brand, and just to zip you through right here. If you want to test this out, I'm just going to show it to you quickly. I'm not going to do an in-depth guide, so if you don't know this, definitely look up some racers and how they do it. You want to get to the Fire Mastery with 100% increased damage ASAP, and after that, you're just going to rush to Alley Overload over here. Take Alley Overload, and then path down through these increased damage nodes. Increased damage is incredibly important, obviously. I also take Runebinder. It's not really necessary. It's just a little bit of nice extra once you have Armageddon Brand and you go for Cremation. After that, so after this, you basically have more than enough damage for days, right? And after that, you go to the right side. You go Act 4, Act 5. Now, here is where it gets a little bit fishy, because I did take Snowforged and Ellie hit Mastery, like Ellie Mastery with the Monster Inverted. At this point, your Ignite damage is falling off, so your hit damage is a lot more important. But that is another 4 points that maybe you didn't have to take. Maybe you don't have to take Ellie Focus. Play around with it if you're leveling it. If you don't have to take those points, that would be a huge boon, because then you could prep. Next up, we go Eldritch Battery, but now you can prep for the Mine nodes very well. And after Act 10, we're basically going to be respecking. So we do this, and then we're Act 10, and at this point is basically when we're going to start respecking. I'll put some POBs down below. In conclusion, though, Hexblast of Contradiction is an incredibly strong skill that you can kind of fool a little bit by going Inquisitor. This might be my Leaguestart for 3.25. I'm going to say it straight up. Obviously, we have to wait for patch notes. I want to know what happens to normal Hexblast, because that will determine how big this skill is going to be for other people who might now swap. But even if Hexblast isn't nerfed, this is just an absolutely brutal endgame build, especially all the way up to what Cap Balance did with Hexblast of Contradiction and Energy Blade. But this will depend on so many things. What will happen to Archmage, right? All these things. This build needs way more testing, refining. Just so you know, if you look at the POBs, they're very much like just unrefined. You'll see it yourself. If you have any feedbacks, or if I forget about something, just put it down in the description. I will leave this one on the back burner, obviously, until we have patch notes, but I just wanted to kind of get a feel for the skill, and then we will see apply whatever happens in the patch notes. This skill had an incredible progression throughout the game. Obviously, I didn't really run it through the gauntlet. I didn't really do tier 17s, anything like that. But then again, we don't even know what happens to tier 17s. I didn't do uber bosses yet, but I mean, it would be preposterous with the kind of gear I have right now anyways. But in general, I got a feel for the skill, and this is definitely one of my contenders right now. But either way, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Maybe I could show you something new. And since I still don't have a slogan, see you next time.